Hello, grade 12s. Welcome back from the short break. Just before the break, we were looking at appreciation and depreciation. We know that the currency does appreciate, but it also does depreciate based on a number of factors that we will consider in our discussion now. So let's start off with appreciation because that's something that's positive. So appreciation of a country's currency is an increase in the price of the currency in terms of another currency due to market forces. For example, when the dollar goes from $1 equals to 9 rand to $1 equals to 10 rand, then the dollar has appreciated. So when there's an increase in the price of the currency based on the market forces, we consider that as appreciation. So we say that the currency has appreciated. So it has grown or it has increased. And when we look at depreciation of a currency, it is a decrease in the price of the currency in terms of another country's currency due to market forces. For example, if the dollar goes from $1 US dollar to worth 9 rand to $1 US dollar worth 8 rand, then the dollar has depreciated against the rand. Okay, so when there's a decrease, we call it a depreciation of the currency or of a currency, and an appreciation of a currency comes when there's an increase in the price of the currency. So it's important that you understand this terminology. But an interesting point that we come across, it's the fact that it's caused by market forces. So it's caused by supply and also by demand. Okay, so you're going to move on to our next point. Now, let's have a look at the revaluation and the devaluation of a currency. I know the terminology is getting quite a bit interesting, but we do need to be aware of it because, you know, when people talk in the news or they've been interviewed, they use this terminology when they are referring to the currencies of different countries. So they'll talk about appreciation, depreciation, revaluation, and devaluation of a currency. So let's go through them so that we have a better understanding of what they mean. So we are looking at revaluation and devaluation of a currency. Starting off with revaluation of a currency, it refers to the deliberate increase in the value of the currency in terms of another currency as a result of central bank intervention. This occurs under a fixed exchange system. So if we are looking at the revaluation, we know that it will be a deliberate action from the central bank to increase the value of the currency for a particular reason. So they will not just increase because they feel like, oh, you know what, we need to increase our currency, but they will have a motivation of some sort as to why they are wanting to increase. So central bank is involved and they are using it as an intervention because they want to manage. So when we look at the monetary policy and the fiscal policy, but monetary policy specifically in this particular instance where you've got the central bank being involved because they want to influence the value of the currency. So it is a deliberate action, so just be aware of that and do emphasize on that when you are answering the question around the revaluation of the currency, that it is deliberate to increase the value of the currency, and this is a result of the central bank using this as an intervention, and it occurs under the fixed exchange system. So what is the devaluation of a currency? So a devaluation of a currency refers to the deliberate decrease in the value of the currency in terms of another currency as a result of central bank intervention. So devaluation is an opposite of revaluation because with revaluation you have an increase and then with devaluation you have a decrease. Both of them are deliberate, so it is the central bank wanting to intervene for a particular reason, because there is an economic objective that they are wanting to achieve. So in order for them to achieve that economic objective that they may have, so they would need to play around with the value of the currency using the revaluation and devaluation in order to achieve this objective. So just be aware of the terminology relating to the revaluation and devaluation of currency, and also just be aware of the appreciation and the depreciation of currency. It appreciates when it increases and it depreciates when it decreases. Okay, so the intervention in the market. So previously, or on the last point, we chatted a bit about that central bank is using this as an intervention. So why are they doing this intervention? Why do we need to have interventions in the market? So a symbiotic, a mutually dependent, that is the meaning of the word symbiotic, that's a bit of a tongue twister over there, is a relationship that exists between an exchange rate of a country and its balance of payments. This relationship invites continuous attention from the central bank. Central banks often intervene when the currency is either overvalued or undervalued. Okay, so this will be the motivation why the central bank would intervene when it comes to the currency. So here we're looking at the mutually dependent relationship between the exchange rate of a country and its balance of payment. Okay, so the central bank does monitor this relationship, and it pays particular attention, continuous attention that is, in monitoring this relationship, because it wants to look at situations where the currency is overvalued or when it is undervalued. So they would really like it to have it at a good point where they feel it's not overvalued and also it's not undervalued as well. Okay. And then overvalued. So we say a currency is overvalued when a currency's or a country's currency is valued too high. For example, the South African rand is 7 rand rather than 8 rand for a US dollar. So this can lead to continuous deficits on the current account of a balance of payments. Okay, so not an ideal situation when the currency is overvalued. So then the intervention will then kick in from central bank to correct this particular situation. So they will put corrective measures in place in order to address the issue or the fact that the currency is considered to be under or to be overvalued at that particular point. Now we're going to look at undervalued. So when a country's currency is not valued high enough, for example, the South African rand is 9 rand rather than the 8 rand to a US dollar. Such undervaluation can be demonstrated by continuous surpluses on the current account of the balance of payments. Okay, so it's not a good thing. So when we know that our currency is undervalued, that it should be sitting at a certain point, but it's not. So it will then be considered undervalued, and then we will see that by the surpluses on the current account of the balance of payments. So these are also two important concepts that we need to be aware of. Then moving on to the establishment of the foreign exchange rates. So now we're going to start by looking at the exchange rate systems. So every country manages the value of its currency by determining the exchange rate system that will apply to its currency. There are numerous exchange rate systems. Among these are So we know that there are different exchange rate systems, and each country is responsible for managing the value of its own currency, and also by determining the exchange rate system that they will apply to its currency. So let's have a look at some examples. So we've got the free floating exchange system. This is where the value of the currency is determined purely by the forces of the market. So that is supply and demand. Okay. So this particular market that we're referring to will be the Forex market. Okay. So the forces in the Forex market will determine supply and demand. So the value of the currency is purely determined by the forces of the market. That's the demand for the rand and the supply for the rand. And then this will happen in the Forex market. So that is the first system that a country could possibly use. Then we've got the managed exchange rate. So these are exchange rates which are allowed to respond to market forces within certain limits. So this is managed, it is controlled. So although there will be the forces in the market, but these forces will be limited. So there will be certain limits. So the fact that there will be certain limits, it shows that it's managed because you are managing the response, and you are putting certain limits as well. So this is very much managed or controlled. And then you've got the fixed exchange rate over here. I'm going to pull my screen down so that we can see this clearly. That's better. Okay, so the fixed exchange rates, so currencies are devaluated and revaluated. The gold standard backed the value of the currency to a certain amount of gold. South Africa stepped off the gold standard in 1932. All right, so now we know that South Africa uses the free floating exchange rate. So we currently are using the system. So the value of our currency is purely determined by the forces of the market, the supply and demand, and that happens in the Forex market. But prior to that, we did use the fixed exchange rates, but we did step off it in 1932, where it was backed up by the value or the certain amount of gold. So we have moved away from that particular system. All right, so now we've gone through the different systems or exchange rate systems that a country could possibly use in order to manage its own currency and also the value of the currency. So we've looked at the free floating exchange rate, which is driven by the forces of demand and supply. And then we've got the managed exchange rate, which is more controlled because the response is allowed, the response to the market forces is allowed to be at a certain extent or to a certain limit, and therefore this market is very well managed because then you control the response and it must be within certain limits. And then we had the fixed exchange market, and then gold was also used as a certain amount of the currency. And then at South Africa at some point we did use the system, but in 1932 we stepped off the gold standard system. Okay, so that's just some interesting information and background in terms of where we've come from in the world of the exchange rates. So the terms of trade. So the terms of trade compare a country's export prices with its import prices by means of an index, and the formula is the index of export prices and the index of import prices, and you times that by 100. So we're going to look at an example, a table, just to get a sense of what we mean by this. Okay, so over here, so these are the years, obviously, when the different imports and exports happened. And then we've got our index over here. And then obviously the formula says that the index of export prices, and then obviously then you divide by the index of import prices, and then you times by 100, okay? And then obviously these would be the percentages for those particular years, and then this is the index as well. So it is used to determine the terms of trade. So in order for us to understand the terms of trade, we need to then use this particular formula, and then information will be given to you. And then we've accessed this information from the South African Reserve Bank because they do make this information available to businesses so that they can see the amount of export and import that has been happening in our country, and also to use the given formula in order to determine the extent of trade terms that it has happened or that has been happening in our country as well. So it's important that we are able to engage with this information and then also to work out the formula, but you will be given information so that you could do the calculations in terms of the index export prices and the import prices as well. So that's basically the terms of trade. So you need to know what the definition of the terms of trade is. It's when you compare a country's export prices with its import prices by means of using an index. And then also know the formula, that the formula is the index of export prices divided by the index of import prices, and you multiply that by 100, and then that will give you the answer in terms of the trades that have happened in a particular country. And the South African Reserve Bank does make this information accessible and available to the public and to the business sector so that they can be assisted when making economic goals and decisions using information that's reliable and that has been well researched. All right, we're going to now take a short commercial break, and then I will see you right after the break. Stay tuned.